There are few parts of the world as fiercely contested as Kashmir. This mountainous region on the northern reaches of the Indian subcontinent is split into three by India, China, and Pakistan, and has served as the flashpoint for regional conflict for over 70 years. But how did it get to this state? For that, we must head back to 1947, on the eve of Indian and Pakistani independence. British India was not a monolith. It was actually a patchwork of princely states intertwined with land directly controlled by Britain. In the princely states, local rulers retained nominal control, but had to obey the orders of the British Viceroy in Shimla. Following the end of World War II, the Indian independence movement, led by this guy, who you may have heard of, had gotten too strong for the British to stop. One of these Indian revolutionaries was a man named Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who broke with his colleagues by advocating for a separate nation for Indian Muslims. The British backed him up, and in 1947, a partition was announced. The partition was executed terribly. The line dividing the nations was hastily drawn by one man, this guy, in a single afternoon, with little regard for anything other than religion. It led to mass exodus of Muslims from India and Hindus from Pakistan, which resulted in a communal massacre that left hundreds of thousands dead. The princely states were all given the choice to join either India or Pakistan, or remain independent. The grand majority of them joined India, but those states on the border faced a difficult choice. Kashmir, on the border of the two nations, was one of them. The princely state of Jammu and Kashmir was in the interesting demographic position of having a majority Muslim population, but also having a Hindu Maharaja. Because of this, the Maharaja Hari Singh decided to remain independent to appease both Kashmiri Hindus and Muslims. Pakistan desperately wanted Kashmir to accede into it. Jinnah, who was by this point the Prime Minister of Pakistan, promised the Maharaja extremely favorable treatment for his state, if he decided to join. When this didn't work, and the Maharaja stayed his course, Pakistan grew worried that Jammu and Kashmir was drifting toward India, and decided to attack preemptively. The pro-Pakistani north and west of the state seceded to join Pakistan, and rebel forces invaded deep into the state. These forces were backed by the authorities in Pakistan, and sometimes were even commanded by Pakistani army officials. As rebel tribesmen approached the summer capital of Srinagar, Hari Singh began to realize that he was about to be overrun. He did not have enough forces to counter the insurgency, and appealed to India for help. India told him that Jammu and Kashmir needed to accede to India if it wanted India's help. With the support of the largest political party in Jammu and Kashmir, the National Conference, Singh signed the Instrument of Accession into India. A day later, Jammu and Kashmir became a de jure Indian state. India acted fast. Troops were airlifted to Srinagar, and more were dispatched to reinforce supply lines. The rebel invasion was halted west of Srinagar. At this point, Pakistan declared war on India and sent its own army to bolster the rebels. The Pakistanis pushed for Srinagar and Jammu, but the Indian army halted them and began to push them back. The Indians made multiple peace offers, suggesting a referendum of the people in Jammu and Kashmir, but Pakistan rejected all of them, calling the accession full of, quote, fraud and violence. The war turned into a stalemate, and the UN finally mediated a ceasefire which took effect on January 1st, 1949. The boundaries determined by that ceasefire later solidified into the line of control, which is the de facto border between the two countries today. China entered the area after winning a 1962 war with India. They seized Aksai Chin, a remote eastern part of Jammu and Kashmir. India does not recognize the annexation. Though the borders were mostly set after 1962, conflict continues to plague the region. The decades after independence were marked by a rise in Kashmiri nationalism and a surge in radical Islamism. This all came to a head when, in 1989, the Islamist Party won only 3 out of the 42 seats while winning a third of the popular vote. Widespread accusations of election rigging, which were most likely true, resulted in a massive insurrection later that year. Kashmiri Hindus were targeted, and many of them were killed in their homes and on the streets. Fearing for their lives, most of the surviving Hindus fled the Kashmir Valley for Jammu or elsewhere in India. Of the 600,000 Hindus living in the valley in the 1980s, only 3,000 still live there today. This radical Islamist element has never really gone away from Kashmir, and has repeatedly been spurred on by militant groups in Pakistan to destabilize the region. Terrorist attacks are frequent. Examples include the 2001 bombing of the Srinagar Legislative Assembly, the 2006 massacre of Hindus in Doda, and the 2019 attack on the Indian Army personnel in Pulwama. In response, the Indian government has been using harsh methods to curtail dissent, often leading to global outcry. In 2008, Indian Army troops opened fire on unarmed protesters and killed 40 of them. In 2010, a similar event resulted in over 110 protesters being killed. Fearing that protests could lead to another 1989-like insurgency, Indian forces sometimes cut off power and internet access to parts of Kashmir when tensions are high. The Kashmir problem has no easy solution. According to India, the accession of Kashmir was completely legitimate as it was signed by the recognized leader of the state, and the Pakistani invasion following that was illegitimate by international law. India had offered to hold a referendum in the 1950s on the status of Kashmir if both countries moved their troops out, Pakistan had refused to move its troops out, and thus India had scrapped the referendum. India continues to blame Pakistan for sparking terrorism in Kashmir, and claims all of Pakistani-administered Kashmir as Indian land. India also claims that as a secular state, it has the capability to administer regions of varying religions. Pakistan considers the accession as illegitimate and fraudulent because Hari Singh was coerced into it by India. The fact that the coercion was only possible because of a Pakistani-backed invasion is ignored. Their view is that India has held back on any referendum because the people are in favor of joining Pakistan. Pakistan also denies any terrorist involvement on its part. Pakistan also claims all of Indian-controlled Jammu and Kashmir. Last year, India revoked Article 370 of its constitution, an article which provided a special autonomous status for Kashmir. This brought the state under more direct control of New Delhi, and made it equal to all of the other states in India. Fearing protests, the army cracked down on Jammu and Kashmir, cutting off all communications between the state and the outside world, and instituting a mass curfew. Though these restrictions have now been lifted, global human rights organizations continue to lambast India for the crackdown. The Kashmir problem is not going to go away anytime soon. All three countries involved are rigid in their positions, and it is evident that the borders are fixed for the time being. I would love to say now that India and Pakistan will work together to bring peace to Kashmir, but honestly, it's unlikely to happen.